Hi, so here we are, still talking about part one of Gulliver's Travels. So, Gulliver has managed to make a lot of enemies in Lilliput. He saved the castle from burning down by urinating all over it. That did not go over well with some people. Yes, that's right. Probably a bigger deal was that when he when he captured the Blefuscu Navy, he refused to go back and do any harm to Blefuscu. He did not want, how shall we say, the enslavement to Lilliput of the Blefuscans. And as a result, even though he had done so much good for the people in Lilliput, it was determined that he should be put to death, right? And as I said, he gets wind of this. He basically goes across to Blefuscu, where he is welcomed. And he stays there for a while. And I think this is significant. It's a small little detail near the end. He finds a boat, a real his size type boat, repairs it, patches it up, and sails off, and is eventually rescued. One of the things that he did was he took with him some animals that were, little tiny animals. When we got back to England, he actually made some money with them, right? Kind of showing them off and then eventually selling them. I just keep that in mind. So before we go to part two, just kind of keep in mind the Lilliputians are little people. They're little people size-wise, but they're also little people in terms of their character. As I mentioned, they're petty, they're violent, right? They lack gratitude, and they seem very, very human in many, many ways. Maybe some of our worser aspects, if you will. Part two, Gulliver goes out again. Even though he's had this horrible first experience, right? He says goodbye to his family and goes again on a ship. And again, there's a ship. Well, not a shipwreck. This time, the ship lands to get some more water, fresh water supplies, things like that they can find. And giants are there, and other crew members go off, and they wind up accidentally leaving Gulliver. It is assumed that he will be killed by these giants. As you know, giants are horrible monsters, right? And that's what giants do, right? In all the folk tales and fairy tales of the past, right? That's what giants do. They're horrible, violent creatures. Well, that's not what happens. That's not what happens in Brobdingnag, right? In Brobdingnag, as it turns out, these giants are far more civilized than anybody could have anticipated. And Gulliver is not killed. He's not crushed. He's not, stamped out like a dirty rodent that, the farmers doesn't want. But there is something that runs through the whole time in Brobdingnag. When Gulliver was in Lilliput, Gulliver saw the Lilliputians as little human beings. The Brobdingnagians, never see Gulliver as a tiny person. They see him as an animal. They're very curious about him. At one point, they even think maybe he's a machine, like a clock, which, by the way, is an allusion to deism, right? Where God is the grand clockmaker, if you will, of the universe, and steps away and lets everything go as it goes. But Gulliver is never respected. He's not treated terribly poorly, but he's not treated like a person. Nobody thinks of him as a person. In fact, the farmer starts to show him off, make some money. Watch this little thing. Pretend like it's a big person. In fact, the farmer does to Gulliver what Gulliver had done to the little animals that he had brought back from Blefuscu. It's the exact same thing. The difference from our perspective is Gulliver is not an animal like the cattle that he brought over. But the Brobdingnagians don't see Gulliver as a person. And I think that's something that you really need to think about when understanding this story. Right? Why don't they see him as a person who's just really, really small compared to them? Very interesting to think about, right? They finally, agree that Gulliver is alive, not a machine. But they don't know what to make of him, but they never make him a human, right? You never see him as a human. Now, the farmer is, to an extent, abusive in terms of trying to make money, taking Gulliver around, having Gulliver perform. And he really kind of pushes him to within, inches of his life, so to speak. But he doesn't kill him, and eventually does sell him, right, to the queen, who notices right away how Gulliver is not particularly, how should I put it, gracious or showing gratitude towards the farmer. And he explains why, eventually. Okay. Now, one of the themes, of course, in the stories, both part 1 and 2, is the issue of size, right? Gulliver being so much bigger, and the Lilliputians being smaller, Gulliver being small, and Brobdingnagians being bigger. We talked about the physical issues, right, of eating, urinating, defecating, that were very problematic in Lilliput. Okay? And while because of his smallness, right, certain issues are not difficult, right? They don't have a hard time feeding him, for example, because he is pretty small. Basically, the shoe's now on the other foot, and Gulliver sees the Brobdingnagians in their hugeness. He also is disgusted by them. Their smells, the skin, which is so smooth to normal sight, blown up 10 times the size of what you're used to seeing. You see all the pores, all the little snags and cuts and hairs and oozy fluids coming out, right? It's really gross. Right? Really, really gross. So think about that, right? Again, thinking about that in relationship to the discussion thread questions. In Brobdingnag, right? He sees a woman breastfeeding, right? Breastfeeding a baby, and I'll just read the passage. He says, "I must confess no object ever disgusted me so much as the sight of her monstrous," there's an interesting word, right? "Monstrous breast, which I cannot tell what to compare with so as to give the curious reader an idea of its bulk, shape, and color. It stood prominent 6 foot. It could not be less than 16 in circumference. You'll have the math majors figure that out. The nipple was about half the bigness of my head. Oh my. And the hue both of that and the dug so verified with spots, pimples, and freckles that nothing could appear more nauseous. Okay. So he makes a comparison. This made me reflect upon the fair skins of our English ladies who appear so beautiful to us only because they are of our own size, and their defects not to be seen but through a magnifying glass. Right? So that's why he saw the Lilliputians as so beautiful, and they were so, smooth skinned and all that, because you don't see that stuff. And he does, of course, now in Brobdingnag. And of course, you can also then do the extension, how the Lilliputians must have seen Gulliver, right? Because he, of course, was so much larger than they were. Right? Issues with animals, cats, right? Wasps, things of that nature, and a very unfortunate incident with a monkey. Keep in mind this is way before Darwin, so don't go there with your interpretation on the monkey thing. But it is interesting. Now, unfortunately, Gulliver also plays into this, where the Brobdingnagians don't think much of him, and he kind of tries to puff himself up, and the more he tries to puff himself up, the sillier they think he is. Okay? And there is a passage where Gulliver is talking to the king and trying to tell him about English government. And quite frankly, he's really whitewashing the whole thing. In other words, he's making everything sound so much better than it really is. He's covering over what he sees as all the flaws, right? And he goes on and on about how wonderful their system is. And of course, even as we read it, we know that's not true. And finally, at the end of all this, the king says, and this is at the end of chapter 6, and he says, "By what I have gathered from your own relation and the answers I have with much pains wringed and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." That's what the king says about human beings, about the English in particular, of course, because that's who they're talking about. But it extends beyond that, of course. And this is, as I said, after Gulliver has given the most unrealistic and idealistic account of how things work, even though they don't really work that way. So Gulliver's great idea, so well, I'll really impress you, and tells him about gunpowder and how to make gunpowder would really improve their ability to conquer in warfare. Right? The king is aghast. He is horrified. Right? So the great advance in human knowledge, the great advance in human ingenuity is put towards killing. Gee, I'm glad we don't have that happening anymore in our time, he said. Right? Wow. Compare that to how the Brobdingnagians view their education system, what it's for, what they use it for, what they do with it, their laws, which are exceedingly simple. They have no army that they keep during times of peace, what's called a standing army. They don't have a standing army, right? Everybody just goes home and does their civilian life, right, until they're needed or called for war, right? All these things are what happen in Brobdingnag, the place of giants,